Is ozone therapy safe? What seems to be a very straightforward question has dramatically different opinions across the board. On one side, we have people saying ozone therapy is a miracle cure with no known side effects. And on the other side, you have people saying it could only be toxic. We're going to address the question, is ozone therapy safe? Keep in mind, I am not a medical practitioner, so none of this should be considered medical advice. I went to find the most credible sources I could find on the topic of ozone therapy safety. So I'm going to be putting before you the people I found that claimed ozone therapy is dangerous and the people who claim that ozone therapy is safe. First, when you're looking at ozone therapy, it's important to keep in mind that ozone therapy is a large category. There's actually a lot of different ways that ozone is administered. So ideally, you would be assessing each individual mode of application, but that's a little bit difficult to do. So we're just going to do our best to give a broad overview of the safety of ozone therapy. Secondly, it's important to note that environmental ozone and breathing ozone is different from ozone therapy. Environmental ozone is like pollution and smog. That's ozone that's in the sky that we breathe. It's been shown across the board that that is a bad thing. Nobody really argues on this. The ozone therapy advocates and the ozone therapy naysayers all say that breathing ozone is bad, whether that's from environmental ozone or ozone put off by a machine. It's bad to breathe ozone, and everybody agrees on this. And the reason for that is because ozone is a very strong oxidant, and it oxidizes the lung tissue. So then we would wonder, well, if ozone therapy is a really strong oxidant and oxidizes stuff, why are you using it for ozone therapy?
This begs the question. Does ozone cause different effects based on the tissue it's exposed to? Ozone therapy advocates would say yes. Ozone reacts differently to, say, blood than it would to the lungs. Although it's toxic to the lungs, they say, in small doses it can cause a beneficial stimulation in the blood. Nonetheless, there are still many people who still consider it to be quackery, and they say ozone is always toxic. It doesn't have any beneficial effects.
We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that today. When you're looking at the safety of ozone therapy, the number one thing you come across is the FDA. The FDA takes a very strong stance on ozone, and they say ozone is a toxic gas with no known medical benefit. And it actually makes a lot of sense why they would say this. Why would they take any other stance? Ozone therapy is very unlikely that it'll get FDA approved. Number one, it's super cheap. It's just using oxygen, so it doesn't generate a lot of revenue. Getting FDA approval is incredibly expensive. You need tens of millions of dollars to get FDA approval to fund the studies that are needed to prove its safety and efficacy. So the likelihood of FDA approval from that standpoint is really low. The second thing is that an ozone generator is not patentable. You can't patent an ozone generator, so even if you did assemble the money and get it FDA approved, it would be fair game for the bigger, better company just to come and make their ozone generator and kick you out of the market. So from a company standpoint, that's a very risky thing, and there's not a whole lot of people that would ever be interested in touching that. Plus, if the FDA said anything else about ozone, they would in some sense be saying, well, yeah, it could have some medical benefit, and then they would have to regulate it. They would have to manage it. Why would they spend their time managing something that's never going to get FDA approval when they could spend their time managing things that are likely to reach a lot of people? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the FDA to say anything else about ozone other than it's a toxic gas with no known medical benefit. Not to mention, we do know that it's very toxic to the lungs. However, even though the FDA took this very strong stance on ozone back in the early 2000s, there was a company called Vasogen that made it to phase 3 FDA trials. To get to phase 3, they had to make it through phase 1 and phase 2. Now, in phase 1 of FDA trials, you actually have to prove to the FDA that what you're doing is safe. Vasogen was using ozone therapy, albeit a very specific form of ozone therapy. They were taking the blood out of the patient, infusing it with ozone, and re-injecting it. So they got through phase 1 of FDA trials where they said ozone therapy is safe, and the FDA wrote off on that, said, yep, it's safe. And they got through phase 2, which is saying ozone therapy is effective, and the FDA wrote off on that, saying, yep, ozone therapy is effective. So it's kind of interesting that there's these two contrasting points of view. On one side, you had this company, Vasogen, that got through phases 1 and 2 of FDA trials, but the FDA nonetheless still takes a very strong stance. Ozone is a toxic gas with no known medical benefit. Another source claiming the dangers of ozone therapy is the Journal of Oncology and the American Cancer Society. I found that they took a strong stance on it as well. They said ozone therapy is dangerous. You should not do it. But when I look at the sources that they cited, I was quite disappointed because the source that they cited actually said that ozone therapy has no adverse side effects. And the side effects they listed were the ones that people get from drawing blood, which is like redness, burning, local pain. So they said it was dangerous, and the source that they cited was only the side effects of injecting something into a vein. So I was kind of disappointed that this type of journalism or scientific research made it into these reputable resources because it really was not substantiated, or it was not evidence that ozone therapy is dangerous. It actually said the exact opposite of what they were trying to say. Along with the Journal of Oncology and the American Cancer Society was the Journal of Cardiology, who also said ozone therapy is dangerous. And they didn't take as strong of a stance, but what they did say was an adverse event. So they had this event where this man had ozone therapy in the morning, and later that day he had a heart attack. And they attributed it to the ozone therapy, but they were just kind of speculating. Even in the paper, they weren't exactly sure if it really was due to the ozone therapy, but they were suspicious of it nonetheless. They didn't take quite as strong of a stance, but they listed this adverse event saying, well, it could be bad. The other organization that had a claim on the dangers of ozone therapy was actually interestingly, the International Scientific Committee of Ozone Therapy. And this is a very large group that is actually advocates for ozone therapy, and they've gotten it approved in 12 different countries as of 2017. But they said direct intravenous ozone is actually dangerous and that you should not do it. Direct intravenous ozone is when you take ozone gas and directly infuse it into the vein. Obviously, that's kind of funky and weird looking, but there are a couple doctors here in the United States who claim they've done hundreds of thousands of treatments, Dr. Robbins and Dr. Rowan, and say they've had really no ill side effects to it. So even in the world of ozone therapy, there's still controversy as to what is safe and what is not. But the more large organization has said do not do direct intravenous ozone. And this is exactly what they said. Its application is strongly discouraged due to the risk of air embolism, which can occur even in the case of using a slow infusion pump and volumes of 20 ml. In the paper that I saw, they failed to cite any sources on these adverse side effects. And again, it is refuted by a couple doctors here in the United States, but that's an entirely different topic that we're not going to get into today. Another thing you'll find on the dangers of ozone therapy are a couple events where they report death with ozone therapy. The first one is the most common one, where there were two men posing as doctors. They were not doctors, they were just posing as doctors, and they invited this woman to their apartment for ozone therapy. Now they were injecting a gas directly into her vein, and they actually were teaching her daughter how to do it for her. Very sadly in the story, the woman did die of an air embolism. We're not exactly sure what they were doing, their precautions, or really anything other than they were saying they were doing ozone therapy and they were injecting some sort of gas into the vein. Nonetheless, that is an adverse event with ozone therapy that has been reported. There were a couple websites that listed a number of deaths due to ozone therapy, but I was unable to actually find any original resources or information. There was another woman who went to Thailand and had a ozone therapy under a Dr. Satori, and she unfortunately did die a few months later after the treatment. But the doctor applying it was applying a liquid and injecting it. Ozone is a gas, so I'm not exactly sure what he was doing. Nonetheless, they did attribute this to be ozone therapy. There were some other adverse events I found. There was a man who had blindness shortly after a back injection with ozone, but it went away pretty quickly. The other one was some people get rashes from ozone. They're actually allergic to it, so there are a few people who get that. But all in all, I was actually pretty surprised that I didn't find more on the adverse events of ozone therapy, especially considering, it's not huge, but it does get thousands of treatments every day. But it might be important to keep in mind that not everybody is going to report an adverse event online or necessarily publish it, so that might be worth noting. Pretty much any time one of these adverse events are brought up to one of the scientific or medical boards for ozone therapy, they claim that it's more due to malpractice and not due to ozone therapy itself. So they claim these aren't really to do with ozone therapy as much as the malpractice or the inability of the practitioner to apply ozone therapy. When you're looking at the claims on the safety of ozone therapy, one of the first things you find are all these papers reviewing case studies on the safety of ozone therapy. A lot of these studies will have 10, 20, 30, 100 people in them, and they'll say ozone therapy had no adverse side effects or very minimal ones. So that's usually the first thing you come across. One of the big things worth noting is the CE Medical Federation has actually approved ozone therapy as a safe and effective treatment. The CE Medical Federation is the European equivalent of the FDA, and they actually approve medical devices for ozone therapy and have approved its use. As of 2017, there are actually 12 countries that have approved ozone therapy as safe and effective. These would include countries such as Spain, Russia, China, Dubai, Italy, and Greece. In the United States, it still stands that ozone therapy is not FDA approved. However, there are largish organizations that educate a lot of doctors every year on the use of ozone therapy. There's actually one organization in the United States that's doing an institutional review board, an IRB, on the safety of ozone therapy. They're trying to prove ozone therapy is safe. One of the larger reports on the safety of ozone therapy is by the International Scientific Committee of Ozone Therapy, IOSCO. They claim to have a report of 644 doctors with 5.5 million sessions approximately, showing the safety records of ozone therapy.
In German-speaking territories, 2,819 surveys were distributed to all the ozone therapists, of which 644 responses were received. Considering all the cases of complications, they were produced in 6 out of every 100,000 sessions, which meant one complication for each 16,667 cases of ozone application. The cases were analyzed to determine in which the cause of the complication had been the ozone itself. In the remaining 84% of the cases, the complications were not related to the actions of ozone, but rather they were the result of incorrect anticoagulant treatments, or of other types of improper treatments, such as the use of medication, wrong techniques of administering the ozone, and non-sterile handling.
However, I was kind of disappointed they didn't actually publish the report. I would highly recommend that if IOSCO has this report, that they should actually publish it to add credibility to ozone therapy. However, if it is true what they say, then they claim that ozone therapy is extremely safe and there is a very low rate of adverse events. When you're looking at scientists for ozone therapy, there is one that kind of stands out above the rest on this topic in particular, and this is Dr. Veliobaci. He's a toxicologist, pharmacologist, biochemist, microbiologist that studied ozone therapy specifically. And he published a paper among many called "Is Ozone Always Toxic? The End of a Dogma." He listed a few things that are dangerous about ozone therapy. Number one is breathing it, whether through the environmental ozone or the gas in the air, whatever it is, don't breathe it. The other thing being it can have an adverse event with skin if you have a very, very high concentration of ozone. You can have a negative reaction on the skin. Third thing was the dose of ozone in ozone therapy. If you use too much ozone, you actually risk lysing a small amount of the red blood cells that you're mixing the ozone with. But he did declare that ozone therapy was safe and it depended on the dose that you use and the method of application.
There have been several arguments for prohibiting the use of ozone in medicine. The first is that ozone is a strong oxidant and a toxic gas that should never be breathed. The second is due to the fact that several diseases are perpetuated by a chronic oxidative stress, and therefore a gas generating free radicals should be proscribed. The third has been the fault of unscrupulous quacks who, without any medical qualification, have injected the gas mixture O2O3 intravenously, causing lung embolism. Thus, it has been easy to label ozone therapy as a dangerous quackery. But the previous sections should have clarified why tropospheric ozone is toxic and why a single pulse of a precisely measured ozone dose in blood is not. The success of ozone therapy depends in using a small and safe ozone dose just above the threshold level, able to stimulate a number of biochemical pathways, finally responsible for the activation of the natural healing capacity.
For whatever it's worth, there are thousands of anecdotes online testifying to the safety of ozone therapy. And these are people who have had experience with ozone therapy and say, yup, it's safe, it did this for me. But just because a lot of people say something doesn't always mean it's true. I mean, we've had run-ins with that in the past.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor?
But purely from an observational standpoint, I do find it interesting that a lot of people are saying ozone therapy is safe, despite all the large institutions that are clearly against it. And my final point on the safety of ozone therapy is the fact that Vasogen did make it to phase 3 FDA trials, meaning they had to go through phase 1 where they prove the safety of ozone therapy. And again, this was for their specific application where they drew out the blood, they infused it with ozone and re-injected it back into the body. They got through phase 1, proving the safety, and they got through phase 2, proving the effectiveness. Thanks for watching. I hope this was a helpful video for you. I found it quite an interesting topic to go over the safety of ozone therapy. From a purely observational standpoint, there seems to be a lot of information indicating that ozone therapy is quite safe. While on the other side, people saying that ozone therapy is dangerous, usually it's for environmental ozone or breathing ozone, and they're taking it out of context. And a lot of times I was kind of disappointed that the larger institutions didn't substantiate what they were saying a bit better, because they were using papers that said ozone therapy is safe, such as the Journal of Oncology and the American Cancer Society. So it kind of seemed from this video that there was more, I'm just saying there was more information, not saying whether it was right or wrong, but more information on the side that ozone therapy was safe. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want any of the resources that I used in this video today, click the link below in the description and you will get access to those.